There are battles in families that do not start with shouting. Some begin in complete silence where every word has weight and every glance carries an unspoken warning. My name is Alyssa Bennett and I live in Rochester, New York. I never expected my life to become a story. People whisper about the kind that makes others lower their voices and look away. Yet here I am. My parents sued me. They sued me the week after my grandmother's estate was read. No slammed doors, no dramatic confrontations, just paperwork delivered to my front door neat and official, carrying the message that my own family believed I had taken something that should have belonged to them. They thought I would hand over what I was given. They thought I would fold the moment they demanded it. They believed I did not have the strength to stand on my own. What they did not know was that my grandmother had seen all of this long before I did. She understood the shape of people's intentions, how love can twist when money enters the room. She prepared for it. She prepared for me. The day I opened the envelope and saw my parents' names printed above mine as opposing parties, something inside me did not break. It solidified. Because that was the moment I realized the truth: some families do not lose you all at once. They lose you choice by choice, word by word, betrayal by betrayal. This is the story of what happened after that moment. If you want to hear how it unfolded, stay a little longer. I promise it will make you think about what loyalty and love really mean. I grew up in a house where love was not shared equally. My parents always found subtle ways to make it clear who mattered the most. I was the younger child, but not the cherished one. My brother Lucas Bennett, and from as early as I can remember, Lucas was described as the promising one. If he spoke, people listened. If he wanted something, it was given. If he failed, excuses were created to soften the edges of the disappointment. With me, there were no excuses. Expectations were strict, but affection was scarce. I spent most of my childhood observing, trying to understand what made someone worthy of warmth in that house. Mom had a gentle voice when she spoke to Lucas, and there was always this softness in her expression when she looked at him. I never saw that look directed at me. Dad once told a family friend that Lucas would be the pride of our family. I was standing there when he said it. He did not notice. And if he did, he pretended not to. I learned early that I was present but not seen. I existed in the spaces left over after Lucas was finished shining. Lucas was encouraged to explore everything. Sports teams, debate club, private tutoring, college preparation programs. Mom and Dad would sit at the dining table reviewing his progress and planning his future while I washed the dishes nearby. I tried to do well in school. I studied late at night, hoping that if my grades were high enough, or if I worked hard enough, someone would finally look at me the way they looked at Lucas. When I showed Mom a paper with a high score, she nodded politely and placed it on the counter without a second glance. When Lucas brought home something similar, it was proudly pinned to the refrigerator. The distance between us was not loud, and it did not involve yelling. It was the quiet kind of distance, the type that forms when attention becomes a form of currency that you learn you cannot afford. I kept my feelings to myself. I learned how to move silently through the rooms of my own home. There was only one person who saw through all of it. My grandmother, Alyssa Bennett. She was my father's mother, and she lived only a few minutes away. I visited her almost every afternoon after school. I did not go there to escape, although perhaps I did without realizing it. I went because she asked me questions no one else bothered to ask. She wanted to know what I thought about books, what I feared, what I hoped for, what made me laugh. She never asked me why I was quiet at home. She already knew. She had a way of speaking that made silence feel safe. We would sit in her living room, sunlight spreading across the floor, the smell of rosemary and tea filling the air. She would hand me a blanket on colder days and tell me to rest. I remember one evening when she told me that being overlooked did not mean being unworthy. She said that sometimes the ones who are ignored grow roots. Others cannot see roots strong enough to hold them when storms come. I did not fully understand then, but I held on to her words anyway. They were the closest thing to protection I had. As I grew older, the distance within my home did not shrink. Lucas was praised for achievements that were expected of him, while mine were treated as accidents. I learned how to live without waiting for recognition. But my relationship with my grandmother deepened. She shared stories of her own childhood where she too had once been overlooked. She taught me how to cook her favorite recipes, how to fold linens properly, how to manage savings, how to speak firmly even when my voice wanted to shake. Those were not just lessons, they were preparations. Looking back now, I realize she was building something inside me. She was giving me strength piece by piece, gently and quietly, in ways that did not draw attention. It was the kind of strength that does not announce itself, but reveals itself when needed. And later, when everything broke open in my family, that strength would be the only thing I had left to stand on. Years later, when I had already settled in Rochester and was living on my own life, felt different from the house I had grown up in. I rented a small apartment near Highland Park, worked at a local community health center, and kept mostly to myself. Independence was something I had to learn slowly. I did not receive holiday phone calls or check-ins unless they concerned appearances or family gatherings. Lucas would occasionally send updates about his career moves, usually forwarded through Mom. I never expected warmth, only formality, and I learned to live with that distance. During that time, Eleanor began to get sick. The decline felt gradual at first, a few missed appointments or moments of forgetfulness, but I saw a change in her eyes when I visited one autumn afternoon. She was sitting in her garden, the one she pruned every week, and she stared at the trees as if searching for something she could not fully reach anymore. When she looked at me, she smiled, but there was a softness, a fragility that I had never seen before. I felt something tighten in my chest because she had always been the one constant force in my life, and now even that felt uncertain. I started driving to visit her every weekend. Sometimes I brought groceries, other times I simply sat beside her as she rested. The routine felt natural, almost instinctive, as if I had been preparing for that role all my life. She would tell me stories from her youth, small pieces of history that felt like lessons wrapped in gentle humor. I listened carefully because I knew there was meaning in every story she chose to share. I wanted to remember her voice, not just her words. Mom and Dad visited occasionally, but their presence always felt scheduled, planned around obligations or community appearances. Lucas visited even less, though when he did show up, he behaved as if he had carried the weight of the world to her doorstep. He stayed long enough to take photographs helping in the kitchen or adjusting her blanket, then left early for meetings or social events. Eleanor never commented, but her silence carried understanding. She saw everything without needing to react to it. As the months passed, her health declined more sharply. The doctor recommended hospice care, and I was the one who stayed during the longest nights. Eleanor slept often, her breath steady but quiet. There were moments when she woke, looked at me with clear eyes, and squeezed my hand as if to remind me that love could be spoken without a single word. One evening, when the house was still, she whispered, "You know who you are. Don't let them decide it for you." I promised her I wouldn't, even if I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. When she passed, it was gentle. The room felt still, as though the world had paused to acknowledge her leaving. I sat beside her for a long time because I wasn't ready to let go of the only person who had ever made me feel seen. The quiet felt different from the silence of my childhood home. This silence was grief, not emptiness. The funeral was held at the small stone church near her house. The service was elegant and respectful, with flowers she had grown throughout her life arranged near the altar. People who had known her for decades came to share memories of kindness, warmth, and quiet strength. I stood near the front listening, holding those words close, because they described someone I loved and someone I feared I would never find again in this world. Lucas stood beside my parents. They greeted guests with practiced expressions of sympathy and dignity. Mom cried, but her tears felt distant, as though she mourned something she believed she should feel, rather than what she truly felt. Dad remained composed, speaking to others about legacy and community. I felt separate from them, even as we stood only a few feet apart. It was as if we were connected by name, but divided by truth. After the service, I returned to Eleanor's house alone. The house felt different without her, quieter but still full of her presence. I walked through each room, slowly touching the books she had read, the chair where she had embroidered, the window where she once watched the first snowfall every winter. I sat there for a long time, knowing something in my life had shifted permanently. I had lost the one person who had always believed in me, and I had no idea that the next change waiting for me would reveal everything she had seen long before I did. 1 week after the funeral, we gathered in the office of our family attorney, Mr. Whitaker. The building was one of those quiet, converted townhouses near the courthouse, with tall windows and heavy wooden doors that seemed meant to mute sound rather than allow it to pass. The room where we sat felt orderly, almost sterile, with shelves of leather-bound volumes lined precisely behind his desk. I sat in one of the chairs positioned in front of him, while Mom, Dad, and Lucas sat together on the opposite side of the room. The arrangement was not intentional, but it felt symbolic, as though the air itself had already divided us. Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, shuffling a stack of documents that appeared well prepared, as if this reading had been arranged long before. His voice maintained a professional calm, free from emotion or emphasis. He reviewed Eleanor's estate, beginning with the assets that were familiar to me: the house, the savings account, the small investments she had tended to carefully over the years, and the trust account that she had always referred to as something she would discuss when the time was right. I listened closely, though a part of me was still recovering from grief, and the sound of her name spoken in legal form felt distant and unreal. Mom folded her hands neatly in her lap, wearing an expression that suggested anticipation mixed with restraint. Dad leaned back slightly in his chair, jaw tense but composed, as if preparing himself to respond in whatever tone the situation required. Lucas kept his gaze forward, focusing on a spot near the desk, perhaps attempting to project maturity or patience. No one spoke. When Mr. Whitaker announced the division of the estate, I felt the room shift, even though no one moved. He stated that I would receive 90% of everything Eleanor had owned, including the house, the financial accounts, and her personal items. The remaining 10% would be divided among Mom, Dad, and Lucas. The numbers were clear, not softened or framed. They were simply read into the room like fact. I kept my eyes lowered, not because I felt shame, but because I could sense the silence behind me tightening. Lucas inhaled slowly, though he did not speak. Mom's hands remained folded, but her fingers stiffened imperceptibly. Dad blinked once, as though recalibrating his thoughts, but said nothing. There were no raised voices, no immediate protests, no accusations. The absence of reaction felt heavier than any outburst could have been. It was the kind of silence that had history in it. Mr. Whitaker continued, explaining that Eleanor had written personal letters to be delivered privately at a later time. His tone did not change when he added that the trust contained a standard protection clause that would apply in the event of any dispute. He did not elaborate, and I noticed the way his eyes briefly settled on me, not warning, but acknowledging. The words were simple. The trust contains a protective provision should contest arise. Nothing more. No one asked for clarification, though I could sense questions forming behind every controlled expression. The silence stretched again, not empty, but calculating. Mom finally thanked him, her voice gentle and polite, almost overly measured. Dad nodded once. Lucas stood. When they stood, though, he appeared slower to move, as if processing details that required time to settle. We walked out of the office together, yet not together at all. The hallway felt narrow, the air close. Outside, the winter sky was a muted gray that seemed to flatten everything beneath it. Mom spoke about scheduling another family dinner soon. Dad mentioned the drive home. Lucas did not look at me. I had nothing to offer either, not because I wished to be cold, but because the moment had already revealed a fracture too deep to ignore. I returned to my apartment that evening with the envelope containing the initial estate documents placed carefully in my bag. I sat at the kitchen table letting the quiet return. There was no triumph in what had happened, only a feeling of inevitability, as though the truth had finally surfaced in a form that could no longer be reshaped or softened. What none of us said that day was that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were far from peaceful. There was no shouting at first, no direct confrontations, only an atmosphere that shifted slowly until every conversation felt like walking across a frozen lake that could crack beneath my feet. Mom began calling more often, her voice carrying a softness that felt practiced, as though she had rehearsed each line before dialing. She asked how I was holding up, mentioned how difficult the loss had been for all of us, and then paused just long enough before guiding the conversation toward what she truly wanted to discuss. She said it might be healthier for everyone if the inheritance were adjusted to reflect balance in the family. She avoided using the word fairness, but it hung in the silence anyway. Dad reached out less gently. He insisted there must have been a misunderstanding in the will, that Eleanor could not have intended something so lopsided. He spoke as though he were explaining something sensible, something reasonable, something I should already agree with. His tone carried the weight of expectation I had known for most of my life, the expectation that I would bend. I listened, but I did not bend. Lucas joined them soon afterward, though his approach was different. He sent long messages explaining that the distribution had created tension none of us needed, insisting that I was in the best position to do the right thing. He said it was not about money, but about unity. When I did not respond the way he wanted, he accused me of letting grief distort my judgment. According to him, I was being selfish. The word lingered familiar, like a label I had spent years trying to peel away. The conversations became more pointed. Mom began questioning whether I truly understood the responsibility that came with what I had been given. Dad reminded me of everything they had provided while I was growing up. Lucas said I was repeating the cycle of emotional distance that had damaged our family in the first place. Each exchange seemed to tighten something inside me, not anger exactly, but a weary kind of clarity. I had anticipated resistance, but I had still hoped for something better. I refused every request. Not because I did not understand the magnitude of the inheritance, but because I understood exactly why she had entrusted it to me. Eleanor had seen me. She had known the difference between affection that is genuine and affection that is conditional. She had known what the others had never taken the time to recognize. I would not dilute the last thing she ever chose to say. The tone shifted once they understood I would not negotiate. The calls became shorter and sharper. The pauses turned into cold interruptions. Lucas stopped trying to persuade me and began listing everything he believed he had been denied in life. Dad said I was tearing the family apart. Mom asked whether I could live with myself if this was how our story ended. One evening, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope with my full name printed across the front in precise black lettering. Inside were documents filed through the county court. They had hired an attorney and were formally contesting the will, requesting a redistribution of the estate based on what they called reasonable entitlement. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once laughed with Eleanor over breakfast pastries on quiet mornings. I spread the papers out in front of me as the room filled with the steady hum of the refrigerator. There was no shock, only a slow, heavy exhale. I knew this was where we had been heading from the moment the will was read. Every conversation had been a step on a path already laid out. They had chosen to make this a battle. So I would fight. I picked up my phone and called an attorney. The day we went to court, the air in the room felt dense, as though no one could take a full breath. The benches were nearly full, not because anyone outside the family cared about the outcome, but because my parents and Lucas had brought people they wanted to witness what they assumed would be their triumph. I sat beside my attorney, who I had first met only weeks earlier. Her name was Harper, and she carried an expression of quiet confidence that did not require display or force. She had reviewed every page of the trust documents multiple times, and I had followed her instructions with a kind of exhausted faith that came only when there was nothing left to lose. My parents sat across the room, rigid and determined. Lucas looked unsettled, though he tried to mask it with indifference. He avoided my eyes. He had not spoken to me since the day the lawsuit was filed. We were only a few feet apart, yet we may as well have been strangers. The judge entered and everyone rose. The proceedings began with routine formalities, statements of intention, confirmations of identity and representation. The tone was polite, though strained the way all things are when anger has been polished to appear rational. Their attorney began by arguing that the inheritance distribution was fundamentally unjust, that Eleanor must have been influenced or confused in her final years. He spoke of imbalance of long-standing family roles, of expectations that had shaped how we had all supposedly understood each other. There was a moment when he tried to imply that I had manipulated her. The words passed through the room like a cold draft, but Harper did not react. She waited, composed and still. When it was her turn, she stood without altering her posture. Her voice was steady, not raised, not dramatic, simply clear. She told the court that the will and trust were structured with deliberate care during a period when Eleanor had full legal capacity, confirmed through medical documentation and certification from her estate planning team. She referenced dates, signed filings, independent evaluations. Everything had been prepared 2 years before her illness began. The foundation of their claim dissolved with each sentence Harper delivered. Then she requested that the court unseal and read a provision that had remained confidential until this moment. The judge examined the document, then nodded. The clerk read the clause aloud. It stated that the trust was a no-contest clause, paired with a spendthrift trust structure. If any beneficiary contested the will or attempted to alter distribution, that beneficiary would immediately forfeit their share, and the forfeited amount would be transferred to a charity selected by Eleanor. Furthermore, the clause specified that the forfeiting party would assume full responsibility for all legal fees incurred in the dispute. Silence overtook the room. Not uncertain silence, but something final, like the closing of a door. Mom's face drained of color. Dad leaned back, his jaw tightening as though he physically refused to believe what he had just heard. Lucas looked at me for the first time in weeks, his expression bewildered, almost pleading, as though I could undo the consequences for him. But none of this had been mine to design. I had not crafted the trap. I had only refused to run from it. The judge confirmed the enforcement of the clause. The 10% they had fought for dissolved in an instant and transferred to a literacy foundation Eleanor had supported quietly for decades. Their legal costs became their own burden to bear. The outcome was not loud. There was no outburst, no shouted accusations. Only acceptance settling heavily across the room, as though the truth had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. When the session adjourned, they did not approach me. They stood together, the three of them unified in loss, yet fractured beyond repair. I walked out of the courthouse with Harper beside me. The sky outside was pale and quiet. I did not feel victorious. I felt released. Time passed and silence was the only thing that remained. Not the comfortable silence of people who understood each other without words, but the heavy quiet that settles in the space where love once existed. After the court ruling, my parents withdrew into themselves. They did not speak to me directly, nor did they apologize. Instead, they carried their loss like a shadow that followed them everywhere. I heard from distant acquaintances that they struggled to explain the situation to others without admitting what they had done. The truth lingered around them, shaping their reputation in ways they could not control. Lucas reacted differently. He tried to rationalize what happened by blaming the world, the legal system, even Eleanor. Never once did he consider looking at his own choices. He did not reach out to me. Not a message, not a call. He moved further away emotionally, as if the distance could protect him from acknowledging that his anger had led him to lose something real. He threw himself into work for a short period, then retreated when the pressure of disappointment became too much to hide. I understood that he was not ready to accept what happened, but his refusal to confront the truth made reconciliation impossible. For me, the world became quieter in a way that felt new. I continued living in Rochester, maintaining the small routines that grounded me. Some mornings I read on the porch with a cup of warm tea, remembering how Eleanor used to do the same, sunlight touching her shoulders like a blessing. I found myself drawn to the literacy foundation she supported, the same organization that received the portion my family forfeited. I began volunteering twice a week, eventually contributing more of my time and resources. Every hour I spent there felt like a conversation with her, a continuation of the love she gave me when no one else thought I deserved it. I did not donate in her name or make announcements about my involvement. Quiet service felt more honest. Sometimes I helped children choose their first chapter book. Sometimes I sat beside adults who were learning to read for the first time, tracing letters with patience. There was something humbling and deeply grounding about witnessing growth that came from persistence rather than entitlement. My parents never understood this part of Eleanor, the part that believed dignity came from self-determination. Their relationship with generosity was always conditional. Lucas inherited that belief. Losing them was painful, but holding on to them would have been worse. I did not reach out. I did not shut the door loudly either. I simply turned toward the life that had been waiting for me all along. There were days when grief came back with surprising force. Grief for Eleanor, grief for the family I had once hoped to have, grief for the child inside me who spent years trying to earn a place at the table. But grief softened over time. It stopped being sharp. It became something quiet and steady, something I could hold without being consumed by it. I kept Eleanor's handwriting framed above my desk. A simple line from a note she once left in a book for me. "You are already enough." For years, I had read those words as encouragement. Now I read them as truth. I did not win. I did not triumph. I simply survived with my sense of self intact. That was all I ever needed. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within the walls of our own homes. Love does not excuse harm, and loyalty does not require self-abandonment. Eleanor understood that protection is a form of love, especially when the people we hope will cherish us choose to do otherwise. Strength does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like walking away, choosing peace over approval, and building a life rooted in dignity rather than permission. Thank you for listening to my story all the way to the end. I appreciate your time, your presence, and your willingness to sit with the emotions it carries. Every family story is complicated, and perhaps something in mine resonated with your own experiences. If you have thoughts, reflections, or similar journeys, I would be grateful to hear them. Your voice matters here.